Again, a little bit of a late start here, so apologies for that. Before we get started today, quick announcement. I announced last time that your midterms were ready and you guys picked them up. Apparently I said also that your maps were ready, which put an undue strain on Tony, but she was a champ and she ended up finishing up your maps for this week too. So you guys can pick those up at the end of class. And I'm going to be around after class too. If you guys have questions about the midterm, if you have questions about your maps, I'm going to have office hours in my office. So you guys can stop by if you like, around 12 o'clock. Yeah, Tony.
Posted on announcement, there's another talk. If you're still interested in doing extra credits in San Francisco, so it's September 13th.
Oh, great. Okay.
You cannot go on during the week. If you can go on a Saturday, that's also an option.
Oh, that's great. Yeah.
So all the information is on this page on the announcement.
Yeah. Fantastic. What was the talk about again?
It's so shadow review on the Persian Empire, history and the Persepolis fortification.
This one's about the Persepolis Fortification Archive. Yeah, this is going to be a very interesting talk if you can make it to San Francisco. Again, from a much later period, coming from a Achaemenid capital, Persepolis. It's a massive archive that has a really interesting history. Not only does it talk about sort of the inner workings of the Achaemenid Empire, but these were artifacts that recently have been in the news. A judgment was passed against the country of Iran, and for its participation in terrorist attacks in Israel. Long story short, these tablets were actually seized at one time, and it was thought they were going to be sold at auction to pay reparations in this court case. So it's a very interesting, on a number of fronts. But that's great. Okay, cool. So we'll check that out. Any other bits of news before we dive back into? Okay, why don't we get started then? So speaking of archives and large centers, we're going to be picking up where we left off last time. We're talking about the fragmentation of the Ur-3 state. We were only with the Ur-3 state for a short period of time before, again, just like the Akkadian Empire, we see it fragmenting and collapsing around 2004 BC. That process that takes place after the collapse of an empire, the fragmentation and then reintegration and reorganization of these city-states into new powers is something we looked at with the emergence specifically of these nomadic people known as the Amorites, who are coming in from modern, the Levant, right? So modern Israel, Jordan, and southern Syria. We talked quite a bit about a particular Amorite ruler, Shemshi-Adad I, who ruled from around 1813 to 1781. A ruler who briefly forms this large empire, not a large empire, but a rather small one, up in the north, beginning again with the site of Shubat and Lil, Tel Leilan, and then installing his sons at the city of Ekalatum, which is near Ashur, and then at the city of Mari as well, two sites that are right on the Tigris and Euphrates, and meant to control trade with Anatolia. We talked about the trade with Anatolia, the Karam trade at Kanesh, with textiles and tin going north, and gold and silver and other commodities coming south. We actually have some texts relating to this period that tell us a little bit. Again, not too much in terms of art. We looked at the Mardin stele, are one example possibly of Shemshi-Adad himself. The Assyrian king list, later Assyrian king lists say Shemshi-Adad came from Babylon and seized Akalatum and resided there for 3 years. He deposed Erisham, son of Naram-Sin, a different Naram-Sin. This is actually somebody taking Naram-Sin's name later on. But anyway, the king of Akalatum at the time, he seized the throne and ruled there for 33 years. So from the king list, again, we see we're dealing with an usurper, somebody who's coming in from outside, and again, somebody who's going to establish their capital not in a city that has a long history, not in a city where there's entrenched power structures and families you're going to have to deal with and facing possible assassination attempts. No, you're going to go to a new place, you're going to found your capital elsewhere, and that's what Shemshi-Adad does, establishing the capital of his new old Assyrian state at Shubat Enlil. This goes quite well for him. The sort of sense of conquest. Again, we see him taking Shubat Enlil, Ashur, and then of course Mari. And Mari is what we're going to be talking about today. We've seen Mari in the past. If you remember back to our discussion of the early dynastic period, this is the same Mari that is producing those wonderful votive statues, the ones such as Ur-Nanshe. If you guys remember Ur-Nanshe, these wonderfully rendered stone statues, again, some of the most naturalistic of their time. And Mari, for that reason, and its location is very, very important. It was actually destroyed by either Sargon or Naram Sin during the Akkadian period, and then begins to resurge during the Ur III dynasty. The local king that takes power is known as Ikadur Lim, and you can see his name right there. And Ikadun, I'm sorry, it's Ikad, not Dur, but Ikadun. We're told that he's actually assassinated by his palace entourage, and this is a problem in the sense that if you have competing interests in a region, many times, right, you can fall victim to the people who are closest around you, the people who are responsible for clothing and feeding you within these massive palaces at the time. It's possible Shemshi-Adad had something to do with it and maybe engineered this plot to overthrow the city. One way or the other, we do know that Ikadun Lim dies and Shemshi-Adad takes control. We saw last time Shemshi-Adad installs his son Yasma-Adad at Mari and his other son Dagan at Akalatam near Ashur. This is the same Yasma-Adu who was quite a disappointment to his son. We actually have other records from the period that talk in terms of Ikadun Lim's successor and son Zimri Lim. So Shemshi-Adad's taking over, the new king is dead, he's put his son in place, and the son of Ikadun Lim, Zimri Lim, is sent into exile. So the rightful heir of the kingdom of Mari, Zimri Lim, is sent off into exile. And we actually have letters of Zimri Lim during this period talking in terms of this problem. So he actually states, writing what was he writing to? To Tel Rimmah. He says, speak to Hatun Rabi, thus says Zimri Lim, previously, indeed, I've sent to you once or twice a full report of the troops of the man of Ashuna, the man of Ashuna being Shemshi-Adad, that the troops of this man have come up against me. Now herewith, I've brought you this tablet of mine. Since 3 days have gone, I've gone to help in my own territory to face down this man of Ashuna. If his troops will withdraw before me, then they withdraw. But if not, and they do not withdraw before me, then I will fight with my own troops. I will not withdraw. Ever since I have been sending you messages to come and help me, your support troops have not come. I'll now tear out the claw of this man of Ashuna in my territory with my own troops, and I'll deal with him so that he'll never come up against my territory again. So Zimri Lim, in exile, tries to attack Shemshi-Adad back at Mari to retake his birthright. But again, we see that this doesn't go so well for him. We have letters of his generals writing back. For example, this one from Yassi Dagan. Now the kings in the whole land are set on fire against my lord. And Buntu Ishtar stood up and said as follows, Zimri Lim has withheld his best troops from us and sent us weak troops, and we will all die with them. The kings in the whole country are looking out for my lord, and if only my lord had straightened out this situation with the people of the land, then they could have come here, and the man of Ashuna would have withdrawn already long ago, and his land would have returned behind my lord. Now my lord must confer with his servants and have extispicy, right, that process of divination, looking at livers, performed about his considerations in keeping with positive predictions. Otherwise, my lord must send a message to the generals, and they must take lead of 1,000 or 200 troops, or 2,000 troops, and come here once the season begins, and we can fight this man of Ashuna. So really, we see that Shemshi-Adad has done a very good job of creating, especially with these family members, these three major cities, and taking control of this region. And Zimri-Lim has a very difficult time taking it back. We'll come back to Zimri-Lim a bit later. But under these new Amorite rulers, the king and the palace become this concentrated locus of authority and power. They control the economics, as we saw last time. And this is reflected in a grandiose palace that was built during the time at Mari, which we'll look at in a second. I just want to also mention, when we read these texts about warfare, we read about troop movements and things like that, it's also during the second millennium that we see a few introductions in the practice of warfare that change the ground game pretty drastically. We saw during the time of Sargon how Sargon used different types of troops to back one another up to make his military units that much more effective. Archers and ground infantry. Well, it's during the second millennium that we have the introduction of a very important new weapon, and this is the horse-drawn chariot. Horses, we know, were domesticated around 4000 BC in Asia, but they were only introduced into the ancient Near East around 2000 BC. Even during the time of the Old Babylonian period, Old Assyrian period, where that Kanish trade is taking place with Anatolia, donkeys are primarily your beast of burden. Horses, they were attempted, the first experiments were sort of they used them in a similar way, but very quickly they were adapted for warfare because of their speed and because of their ability to get in and get out of a situation quickly. The bridle and the bit were developed around 1700 BCE. And really what this allows you to do now is steer a horse, and you can put a chariot behind it, a chariot that's really a very amazing piece of engineering. Super light, but also super strong. We have Egyptian examples that are still intact from the New Kingdom, period a little bit later than this, when Egypt ends up getting the horse, later than the ancient Near East and adopting chariots. But these wheels, these spoked wheels, which are not here, these are just wooden wheels put on to this model. These spoked wheels are incredibly strong and allow for the carrying of really what would be a crew of two. You'd have somebody driving the chariot and steering it, and then somebody standing next to them, probably an archer. The idea being that you could very quickly come up to a column of troops, surround it, and as a quick moving target begin to pick off troops using a bow and arrow. Again, this crew of two is necessary. In a lot of Egyptian iconography, you'll see the Egyptian king standing there with the reins in one hand, or kind of tied around and then shooting arrows at the same time. This is because he's the Egyptian king. And of course, he's God incarnate. You can't do this. You need two people to run a chariot team. But again, this is a weapon that changes the ground game quite a bit. Strategies, as we'll see, and comes to dominate warfare for the next 1,000 years. We also see evidence of siege warfare. These texts that come from cities like Mari talk about them falling under siege, and this new emphasis on walls and defenses. Siegecraft becomes very important, starving out a city and forcing it to surrender.